Okay, I think we're set now. Well, the topic of my discussion today, or my presentation, I've titled it Inside David Rittenhouse. And the reason I said Inside David Rittenhouse is because there's many people that have written about the historical perspective of Rittenhouse, but today I'm going to try to marriage that with the actual clocks that he produced. And I think you'll get a whole nother viewpoint of the gentleman that we're talking about. Now, David Rittenhouse was born in 1732 and died in 1796. And he is probably the most famous clockmaker to have worked during the colonial time period. Thomas Jefferson called David Rittenhouse America's first genius. And of course, he knew most of the majority of America's influential founding fathers, as well as the scientific community. So that's quite high praise. Rittenhouse was so famous that his portrait was painted several times by Charles Willson Peale. And that is the portrait that Peale painted on the left. It's an iconic portrait that you've probably seen in many books. But Edward Savage copied one of these oil paintings and produced it as a less expensive mezzotint on the right. Whoops. And these mezzotints were available following the death of David Rittenhouse, either as a framed or unframed document, and they were sold to his many devoted followers. Rittenhouse is also one of the few colonial Americans to have had his biography written by a contemporary, William Barton. This was done at a time when book publishing was extremely expensive, and very few biographies were ever written. Nonetheless, Edward Parker published the Memoirs of David Rittenhouse, a 614-page Rittenhouse biography in 1813. It is estimated that over 500,000 lead pieces of type were assembled by hand and printed on a printing press, as you see on the right-hand side, by the printer William Brown in Philadelphia. Now, David Rittenhouse is said to have been a self-taught clockmaker. In the 18th century, a formal clockmaking apprenticeship lasted 7 years and required the apprentice to do menial and repetitive tasks for much of that time. David Rittenhouse is unlikely to have had the temperament to succeed at such a task, given his intellectual curiosity. His own biographer states that the youthful David Rittenhouse was more likely to be found doing mathematical calculations than attending to his required chores on the family farm. This farm was located about 20 miles outside the city of Philadelphia in Norton Township, Pennsylvania. It is here that David Rittenhouse established his first clock shop, where he produced both 30-hour and 8-day clocks. His workshop had good visibility since it was located on Germantown Pike, a major thoroughfare into and out of Philadelphia. Now, early Rittenhouse clocks can be crude in many ways, and this has led some authorities to underestimate Rittenhouse's ability. However, one must consider that clockmaking tools and raw materials were often in short supply, and it is highly likely his own experience and the lack of raw materials produced clocks that may not be up to the standards as we would think a Rittenhouse clock should be. Now, David Rittenhouse made several of the 30-hour clocks that were popular at that time for the rural inhabitants, and these included mostly farmers. Here are two examples of the clock movements that he made. Examination of these works can give us some insight into his clockmaking ability and his own personality. And all these movements looked very identical when you first take a glance at them. Upon closer examination, you're going to see some major differences. I believe the upper clock works, and I hope you can see. It looks like the pointer is attached to the. Okay. Here we go. Yeah. I believe that the photograph of the upper clock was made prior to the example of the lower clock right here. And as you can see, the castings in the upper clock actually have holes in them, as well as rough marks from the sand casting. Also, there are rough marks or pock marks on the lever arms And if you'll notice, the gear teeth are not well formed, and the lift lever is just a piece of brass here. Where if you examine the lower example, things have changed. The castings are, whoops, oh geez. The castings are very solid. There's no pock marks here. He finished this much better. And you can see this little lift lever, which was just a piece of brass here. And in normal clocks, you have to be careful when you turn the clocks backwards because you can bend this and break it. Here, he invented, I won't say invented, other clockmakers used it, but you can turn the hands backwards. And there's a little leaf spring there that allows you to do that. And although other clockmakers did it, it really did not become a common feature until modern times. And I think this illustrates that David Rittenhouse was an inventor and willing to try new things. It is clear that David Rittenhouse designed his 30-hour movements to minimize their size to save on brass metal, which was in short supply at that time. Note that he barely had space to drill his holes. See how they're almost breaking through the edge of the plate here? Here's a bearing that's right on the edge of the plate, and now there's another hole down here for the dial, and it's so far on the edge of the plate that actually the pillar that the dial is attached to has to rub against the seat board to line up with the hole. Also, because of the small size, he didn't have enough room for his spring here, the hammer return, so he had to bend it and anchor it in another location. Also, because of the small proximity of the gears to each other, whoops, I'm sorry, these two buttons are right next to each other. He also, the fan governor, which would have hit the verge, he actually had to file out a little bit of the fan in order for it to clear. So there's many improvements that he made to this design, and I think he really was engineering it to mass produce these or to make the same one over and over again so that he could make more money and save on the materials that were being used. But the one thing he forgot about after building these clocks is where the chains would actually hang once they were assembled. And as you can see here, depending on where the chains drop, they can actually rub against the pillars. And in fact, in many of these 30-hour clocks, after 200 years, they've actually physically sawn halfway through the pillar. And of course, he saw this when he first built them, but it didn't stop the clock from running, and so he sold them anyhow. So he was not a perfectionist. I think we can learn from examining these movements. And although Rittenhouse makes a good functional movement, the type of work we are seeing does not live up to his legendary status that we have today. However, it must be remembered that Rittenhouse did not begin his meteoric rise to fame until he was nearly 38 years old. So he was quite old when he became famous. And he was making clocks dating back to his teenage years. So of course we would think that there will be a progression in the quality that he was making. And he also trained his younger brother, and about the time that he was 38, his brother was 30 years old. And so they had two very experienced journeyman clockmakers working in the shop. And they built primarily clocks for the general public because that is what they could sell. It was really not until David Rittenhouse became interested in astronomy, not his clockmaking, that really lit the fuse that propelled him into the spotlight as America's most important clockmaker. Now, the Rittenhouse farm was one of 3 locations set up to triangulate the transit of Venus in 1769. David Rittenhouse built this log cabin observatory with a small window or hole in the roof with shutters that could be closed, and this is how the telescope could be angled and you could see the heavenly bodies. And this was a great scientific opportunity and drew a large amount of public attention, this transit of Venus. Rittenhouse was therefore thrust into the spotlight as one of the primary observers and one of the few people in America who could do the complex mathematical calculations needed to document this event. About the same time, he built an astronomical/musical clock, but little was known about its early history and why it did not gain more public attention, because this was quite an achievement. And I think one explanation may be that its construction was overshadowed first by the transit of Venus, and then overshadowed by David Rittenhouse's own announcement that he was planning on building a clock representing the entire solar system. And this device is often referred to as an orrery. This announcement created such a buzz inside the scientific community and in the minds of the general population. And some historians believe that the Rittenhouse timed the completion of this device, which is shown in this picture, to coincide with his removal from rural Norton Township to join his rightful place with his scientific elite friends in Philadelphia. However, these plans hit a big roadblock because the College of New Jersey sent a representative to view the orrery under construction, and they offered David Rittenhouse a large sum of money he could not refuse. This infuriated the Philadelphia establishment, who thought the orrery already belonged to them, and it could have been funded by the state assembly or maybe some funding from the College of Philadelphia to buy it. It is even suggested in the publications of that time that Pennsylvania closed its borders with New Jersey to prevent the delivery of the orrery to the college. With the sale of the orrery to Princeton, Rittenhouse was no longer welcomed in Philadelphia. In order to be welcomed back to the city of brotherly love, Rittenhouse announced that he would build a second orrery for the College of Philadelphia, which would be much improved over the Princeton unit. And he kept the Princeton unit actually for one more year to copy what he needed to copy from it. And Rittenhouse moved to Philadelphia in 1770, and the second orrery that is shown in this picture was delivered in 1771 to the College of Philadelphia. All was forgiven, and David Rittenhouse once again proved his competence as a clockmaker and astronomer. Unfortunately, upon delivery, the college could not pay David Rittenhouse the full amount he was owed. Therefore, he was required to raise money by giving lectures at the college, and then that money was given back to him for building the orrery. It has often been said that the orreries were built as teaching aids, and they have been used this way for over 100 years. But that was not David Rittenhouse's intention. He himself said they were not for the general purpose of showing the planetary motions, but they were used to calculate the exact position of astronomical events with precision. A device of this type would remove the astronomer from the complex calculations needed to track planets that only a person like David Rittenhouse could do. Hence, it has been overlooked by historians that David Rittenhouse actually built and made America's first mechanical computer. That's what he was building. The shock and awe Rittenhouse created in colonial America can only be compared to the shock and awe of the Apollo lunar landing on the moon in the 20th century. The workmanship and design is still unbelievable, considering these units were made before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, under more or less primitive conditions. Even today, I think it would be hard to find a single individual who could do the hand calculations and construct these magnificent objects. Two years later, in 1773, Rittenhouse built his last and most complicated clock of his career, and it cost $640, which is equal to about $250,000 today if you based it on the equivalent unskilled labor rate. It is now owned by Drexel University and is often called the Drexel clock. It is considered to be one of America's most important tall case clocks. After building the clock, David Rittenhouse slowly removed from clockmaking and focused his career on public service. He became the Pennsylvania State Treasurer and later the director of the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia. He also built an astronomical observatory in his backyard so he could do what he liked to do best, and that was looking at the stars. Now, the Drexel clock was owned by several prominent people in the Philadelphia area. It was donated to Drexel in 1894 and has been the star attraction of the Drexel collection for the last 100 years. The Drexel collection is a museum donated to the university by the Drexel family to instill culture in the students whose curriculum was primarily craft and engineering based. In 2005, a conservation of the clock was undertaken by Eric Chanley Wilson, now deceased, and he asked me if I'd like to help out, and I assisted him. And the clock had not been received any type of cleaning or maintenance in about 50 years. So I'd like to just describe an overview first and then go into some of the technical details and the conservation of the clock. That'll be the second half of this presentation. And so you can see it's quite an attractive dial to the clock. And I'm focusing on the dial because, as we all know, that's what the parts the clockmaker may have had some influence in, although there were dial makers as well. But the mechanical works is what really David Rittenhouse was involved. And he certainly did design this clock, there's no question about it, to make it very, very attractive, as you can see here. And it's a month-going movement. It has a deadbeat escapement, it has a 6-planet Ori. And I won't go through all the other complications listed here, but let's look at them, a few of them anyhow, in detail. So here's a 6-planet Ori, and it only has 6 planets because that was all that was been discovered at that point. So here you have the sun, the planets that rotate around, and then of course the zodiac here. And the interesting thing about this picture is these gorgeous spandrels. And this is another clever thing that Rittenhouse does that most people aren't familiar with. This is a 24-inch tall dial. That's a pretty tall dial. It's a big dial. And he needed that to get all the complications on it. But what you don't understand, it's really a jigsaw puzzle. Where do you get spandrels for a 24-inch dial? They're not off the shelf here in America. Even in England, I don't think you could order them. But you could order standard spandrels. So what he did here is, for those who know what I'm talking about when I say spandrels, normally they're corners, they're triangular in shape. So he took one, and then he just cut out the areas that he needed to fit on the dial, and then bolted it to the dial. And then here he needed a spot. This little triangle is really the same as this triangle right here. So he just cut this one and bolted it over here and used a machine screw to hold it on. And the same down here. He needed a little piece, so he cut another spandrel here, and then he married it to this. So this whole thing is made up like a jigsaw puzzle of little spandrel pieces that he got because he could get that type of spandrel, and he cut them down. So it doesn't look that way, and you wouldn't know that unless I pointed it out to you. So it was very clever of him to do it this way. And here's another picture. This was showing the zodiac dial. And again, here's some more of these pieces of spandrels that he's got screwed on here. And the zodiac dial indicates the position of the sun and moon relative to the zodiac and constellations in the heaven. And it's really an interesting device. This is your sun, and it projects onto the moon. And the moon actually can rotate. As these hands go around, this actually rotates. There's like a little bevel gear in here that allows this to rotate. And it's not a complication you see on many clocks, or very few clocks, but the fact that he added the rotating moon is really even more special, I think. And then he had the moon ecliptic node indicator, and it shows the orbiting of the moon and around the Earth. And again, I'm not an astronomer to go into all the minute detail, but you can see it was another complication that you normally don't see. But the fact that David Rittenhouse knew astronomy, could do the calculations, and come up with the gearing, I think is quite extraordinary. And remember, these were all hand calculations. He didn't have an Excel spreadsheet. He has to do these all by hand. And then there's the equation of time. Now, you do see this feature on many other clocks. I mean, it's not a common, it's a common complication, I guess we could say, on a complicated clocks. But the way he did this is much different than anybody else of the time period. And most people, even today, in order to get the equation of time, which the equation of time, let me define that. It displays the difference between true solar time and mean solar clock time, because we really do not rotate every 24 hours. But most clockmakers just make a cam. They calculate a cam, and in back, that drives the hands either faster or slower to see what the difference is in time. And that's the easy way of doing it, but Rittenhouse did not take the easy way out. What he did is he actually made a kinematic device to generate the equation of time. And how he did that is, and here's the actual device on the back of the dial, and here's a schematic. And it's hard to explain this, but I will try. These gears rotate, and as they're rotating, there's a slider here on another gear that rotates, and another slider in gear here, down here. And the motion that this generates and the motion of that generates sum up. And then they push this arm back and forth, which is basically a rack, and this is a pinion. And so all these two things are all working together, finally generate this movement of the arm back and forth that gives you the equation of time. And I don't know if he invented this, but certainly he designed this one. And again, it's amazing. And it's behind the dial. Nobody would ever know that he did it, but he did. And the musical time train, it certainly has more bells than most musical clocks of the period. Plays 10 tunes on 15 bells with 24 hammers. The music can be repeated on demand, or you can select the music to play on the quarter, half hour, 1 hour, or 2 hours, or you can, if you don't like the music, you can just shut it off completely. And you can also have the tune play 1 to 4 times in sequential order. And now here's another few engineering innovations that Rittenhouse installed in this clock. And this tells us a little bit more how his thought process was. First of all, and this is maybe a little difficult, but here goes the barrel is in 2 bearings, set into the plates. But then he's got a little trapeze that hangs down here that helps support the bearings here. And on the back, you can see a little bit better. Here he's got a little leaf spring here, and now comes down with the little trapeze, and it holds the shaft down here. And I think what he was trying to do was suspend the shaft a little bit more so it could freely move back and forth, because this has to move back and forth to set the different tunes. And the tunes are driven by these pins here like a music box, and they actuate hammers. So this had to slide back and forth depending on which musical tune you wanted to play. And I think adding this trapeze helped it to be a little more easy. There would be less friction involved. So that's one practical thing he did. But one, I think the feature that I like the best here is he actually has a volume control on his musical clock. I have never seen that in any musical clock, to have a volume control, but I can appreciate what he went through, because usually when you deliver these to the customers, how you set the volume is by bending these hammers so they either strike a little harder or a little weaker. And of course, after you set the clock up, the next day the owner calls you up and he says, I can't hear the clock, can you come back and make them strike harder? Or they say, oh, it's striking so loud, we can't get to sleep at night, can you make them softer? And you have to go back and you have to bend each one of these and retune the whole notes, all the notes. It's terrible. But what he did, he put a dial on here, a little knob, and he put a rack and pinion, and it goes out to this arm, which actuates all these tension springs. So you just turn these, and all the hammers are adjusted automatically, just with a little tune, and it's a volume control. I think it's clever. And of course, he had several complications that other clockmakers commonly use, such as a sweep calendar hand, sweep second hand, moon dial, phases of the moon. But those things are pretty much common to many clockmakers who were making a higher end model. So in 2005, the conservation was undertaken to the clock. And I won't go into all the details in this list, but I want to instill in you, and I think it came out in the Westminster Tower Clock lecture, if you sat in on that. When you're dealing with a national treasure, all eyes are on you. And if you do something wrong, you're going to get blamed big time for it. And so it's really in the interest of everybody involved to do really research up front as to what's been done to the clock, what the condition of the clock is, and then of course make sure that you record everything that's been done to the clock and why it was done, and then document that with a written report so that going forward people know exactly what has been done and what should be done in the future. So what is conservation? Well, conservation is not restoration, and I think David Lindow had restored. He had a very good program here at the last lecture series that we had in Philadelphia about extreme restoration. And I agree that the clock he was restoring, which happened to be a Rittenhouse clock, definitely needed extreme restoration. But this did not. This is pretty much a complete clock. Most of it was still there. And so what we were trying to do and what Drexel wanted was to conserve the mechanism, keep it as close to as-found condition, but still they wanted the clock to be able to function and run and play its musical tunes. So that's really what we were trying to achieve. So what did the historical research tell us? Well, you probably can't read this it's probably not big enough maybe to see in the back, but we did find that In 1939, the clock had an overhaul by the Franklin Institute, and we actually found the receipts for that overhaul, which are kind of nice. There's no conservation reports at that time. Nobody did that kind of thing back in those days, but it does give you, it does give you an itemized price list of what they did. And so we can tell that the clock actually is pretty worn out at that time. The anchor and pallets were replaced. We had a pinion and was broken apparently. There was a pinion and shaft replaced. There was some springs replaced, the friction washer, a release spring, etc. and so forth. And at that time, it took 75 hours to make all these parts, and it cost about $115 an hour. So the total cost came out to $150 for all this work that they did on the clock. And a sideline to this, which I find personally interested in, is they did not have a curator at that time. They had a professor whose job was to look after the Drexel collection. You know, if anybody wanted to come in and take pictures or that type of thing, or wanted a tour, they would contact the professor as a side job that he had. And it happened to be a woman was caring for the clock in 1939, and she said, look, this is a national treasure. We would like to get it repaired, but I don't think she had any idea of what the cost of repair might be. And she had no authorization to go ahead with any work, and I think she thought it would be $5 or $10. And when the Franklin Institute came back with $150, she was mortified. And we have the correspondence going back and forth where she said, look, I'm not sure I can pay you. So the Franklin Institute had a very kind letter in return, and they said, you know, dear Mrs. X, we understand your situation, and if Drexel is unwilling to pay us, we will donate the entire amount to Drexel University. So I thought that. So we don't know if Drexel ever did pay, but the offer was made by the Franklin Institute to take up the cost. What is not known to most people is the Franklin Institute never did the restoration of that clock. They had an employee who took it home with him, and he did it on weekends and after work. He worked on it in his house on Glendalough Road in Erdenheim, Pennsylvania. And then I think when it was done, one of the reasons they forgave the cost was that he was willing to give his time just to see this masterpiece working again. Funny thing is, where did I grow up? I grew up in Erdenheim, Pennsylvania, on 702 Avondale Road, 10 houses away from where this guy lived. Isn't that strange that about 70 years later, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. Well, like any good restoration, as soon as you do a good job and you have this thing running, somebody drops the clock. And that happened in a few years later. I think it's what, I can't read it, 1945 or 46. They dropped the clock. But this time Drexel had insurance, and they had some work done for it. And this time it was about over $3,000 worth of damage. We don't know exactly what. We don't have an itemized bill. Definitely they dropped and bent the dial. It's mentioned here, and that's been replaced. But fortunately, it looks like the movement survived the damage. But they did clean up when they got the insurance money. So the other thing we were looking for is photographs. You know, what's been replaced? Do we know what parts were missing and how they were made or remade? And there's very few photo documentation done of this clock movement. There's lots of the outside case, but we did find these two photographs, and these have been published many times, this one here and this one here. They were sort of stock photographs that Drexel would send out. We did find a few 35 millimeter, 120 millimeter, I forget, 120 negatives that actually showed this in the guy's workshop, and here he had it all apart. This is actually very helpful in determining one of the missing springs that had been altered in the clock. But very little documentation had been really done as far as photography. So now we'll move to the actual conservation. The clock was removed from its case in the gallery of Drexel University. We had a special cart built up here, and so nobody would drop it as we wheeled it through the halls. And it was all bolted in there, and there was no way that it could topple over. And then we took it back to the conservation center that we'd set up to do this. And this was all done on site because Drexel did not want to let it out of its possession. And I can't really blame him for that, for insurance reasons and everything else. And so here's Eric Wilson on the right. He was a Chester County clockmaker. He did a lot of local clocks from the Chester, Philadelphia area. He was a restorer. And here he's examining the clock once it was out of the case and on the test stand. And then after the dial was removed, you can see all the complication, all the gearing that's necessarily on the front plate to drive all the astronomical complications. And of course, once that's removed, you can start to see some of the lift levers here that are behind all those gears. And remember that little feature in a 30-hour clock that you could turn the hands backward, that little spring-loaded lever? Well, guess what? In this clock, he used the same little spring leader in this particular movement as well. So he adopted that, and that was a fairly common feature in most of his clocks for most of his career. And after the musical barrel was stripped out and all the hammers were removed, you're left with the basic movement. And of course, this is another. This is like Rittenhouse's rubbing chain. You know, he forgot what he did. He did a perfect job of designing this clock, but he forgot one key thing. You can't put this clock down on its back to open it up to get to the gears. It's impossible to do. Most clocks, most clocks, musical clocks or chime clocks, they have a 3-plate clock here for the main trade, and then you have a 3rd plate where you support the musical drum and some of the gears sometimes or the fly. You cannot take this off. It's bolted on and has a nut that you cannot access unless you open up all the gears and take all the gears out. So you have to build this little table here so that you can sit this down, and these will hang down. The back, that last 3rd plate can hang down with the pillar so you can actually assemble it. So you need a special assembly stand to actually work on this clock. So that's something we pass along to future conservators, that they're going to need this before they get into the actual disassembly like we had. We had to stop everything and go back to the shop and make this part so we could actually disassemble it. So this is reassembling it in the stand. You can see that pillar I said that you cannot take off. There it is. It has to be on there when you start to assemble, and this is after the cleaning. Here's a shot of the back of the dial that gives you an idea of the actual gearing that is used in the clock for the orrery and the other complicated features. And here's some of the parts of the movement scattered around the outside. Here's just the movement alone, all the parts in the movement. And it actually looks pretty simple, and it's not that bad of a movement to work on, to be honest with you. And I think that's because it's well designed. And I think you talk to most clockmakers, if the clock movement is designed well, it's a joy to work on. If it's designed poorly, boy, it can be a son of a, you know. So this one is actually not that bad. It's actually well designed, and I really have to give credit that he designed it very well. We stabilized some of the earlier repairs that had been done to it. We removed things like, you know, the acid flux that people use when they're using soldering irons and that type of thing. There were some of those repairs that we removed. All the parts were left original except for 2. And these basically centered around springs, brass springs. And what had happened, this brass spring had worn so much, about 1/8 of an inch of the spring was now missing. And we contemplated, you know, can you braze, can you weld more brass back and add? And all those things are possibilities, but are you going to cause more damage than good? And are we going to develop better techniques in the next 10 or 20 years? Like laser welding has really come a long way. We may be able to repair these flawlessly in the future. So why screw them up now and make it harder for the next guy? So these 2 parts were actually retired, and they're in the Drexel collection. And anytime they want, they can put those back on the clock, or if better techniques come to restore those, fine, you can do that. But that'll be somebody else's decision to make. And I want to say that this is the type of thing you have to think about, making things reversible. And this is completely reversible. So we made exact reproductions of this particular handspring, and I don't even think that this is the original to Rittenhouse. I think this is one made probably in 1939. And then this return spring also here was damaged and soldered, and it was a real mess. And so I made a new one of those, and you can see here we're filing down the spring, and they're about 8/1000ths of an inch thick, and it takes 2 or 3 tries before I got it right. And I now know what these chronometer makers, they say, oh boy, making D10 chronometers when they're only a few thousandths of an inch. Well, 8/1000ths is nothing in brass, but I can appreciate what they're going through, because it's a real skill, and there's some technique to doing that. So I'll finish up with the assembly very shortly here, but I just wanted to show one of the pieces that I liked of the clock. This is the fan governor for the music train. And this is 1773. And I look at this and I say, look at the design. Look at the sophistication. Look at all the parts, the individual parts. You know, he had these fans he had to make, this he had to make, all these little springs that kept tension on this so you could adjust the speed. And it's just a work of art, in my opinion, that this was made at that time period. And you'll also notice that it's being held by a set of cotton gloves. Following cleaning of this clock, it was never touched by human hands. It was all done with cotton gloves to make sure none of our body oils would be on this. So in the future, if anybody finds fingerprints on it, they're not Bruce Forman's or Eric Wilson's. Okay, so here's the movement assembled and being tested, and I have to, somebody's going to criticize me. You know, what's all this? You're holding this together with chewing gum and baling wire? What kind of workmanship is this? What you have to understand, this clock will not run without its dial, okay? Because all these levers have to be in exactly certain positions relative to the dial setting, or else it will not run, it will not strike properly. So this is sort of a jury rig set up just for the testing, and all this was removed, you know, once the dial was put on. And it actually ran the first time. We really didn't have any problems with it. I was very shocked. And so before it actually got back to the case, I happened to gotten transferred. This was not my day job. I have a second one. I was moonlighting a little bit, although I've been doing clocks for 40 years and I was professionally trained. But it was really my honor to be part of the conservation team that undertook this clock, and it was really nice to see it once again ticking in the galleries of Drexel University. So I hope we did the clock justice, and I hope David Rittenhouse is smiling upon us today for all the hard work we did. So that brings me to the end of my lecture, and I thank you for listening so attentively.